I'm going to be talking about autistic children and adults and the understanding of sex, gender, and reality. So I have some student collaborators. Charlotte Dowker was my first MSc student, and I'll be acknowledging her data, and I have a lot of volunteer RAs. I have no funding. I gave a version of this talk to the BPS Developmental Section Conference, and I had a blank slide labelled funding. So autism and mental health, I'm going to be using the terminology autism or autistic people or occasionally ASD because that's what the original papers use. If you have an issue with terminology, I'm sorry about that. Mental health conditions, including anxiety, are more common in autism, and this includes gender dysphoria. There has been some argument about this, notably from people who seem to think that social transition cures autism, but we will not argue that point very much. Where I'm reporting on clinical findings, this can include a diagnosis of either ASD or gender dysphoria, or it can include traits of either ASD or gender dysphoria. The evidence for higher prevalence is now pretty established. Hisley Gorman looked at every single child who had been through the US Armed Forces medical system and found a 4 times higher probability of gender dysphoria if a child was diagnosed with ASD, and also found that in children who had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, ASD was diagnosed later. Obviously, to me, this is due to diagnostic overshadowing. And Kalitsunaki and Williams did a meta-analysis in 2023, finding 25 studies on the link. And they said they analysed gender dysphoria in ASD, but most studies are of ASD in gender dysphoria. That's not that relevant to this study, but to my study, but I thought I'd let you know that. So here is their explanation for why this might be. So they looked at mentalizing, which is the ability to think yourself into somebody else's mind. There are various forms of mentalizing or empathy. Cognitive empathy has been distinguished from affective or emotional empathy. Cognitive empathy, understanding that somebody else has thoughts different to you, is particularly impaired in some individuals with ASD, whereas affective empathy, the ability to understand that other people have different emotions to you, is usually, that's the kind that people notice when they say that their kids are empathetic. So how can they be diagnosed with ASD if they have empathy? And it's not as difficult, and in fact, in some cases, it's pretty good, understanding that other people have different feelings. It's so particularly for younger kids, and particularly for those with intellectual disabilities, the ability to understand that somebody else's thoughts are different to you is what is particularly difficult for children with ASD. But I kind of feel like this is just restating the problem, because if you have a problem with mentalizing, this is getting on for a diagnostic criterion for ASD. So are you not just saying individuals with ASD have more difficulty with things related to ASD, and this is why they have gender dysphoric feelings? So this was a trait study rather than a diagnosis study. And they conclude, like a lot of people do, that autistic children and adults are generally more comfortable rather with being non-conforming generally, and therefore with being gender non-conforming. I find this a rather unsatisfactory explanation, because if you were gender non-conforming and you were comfortable with being gender non-conforming, you wouldn't have negative feelings about it, so you wouldn't be dysphoric about it. And it's obviously fine to be gender non-conforming, and I would hate for anybody to tell me not to be an outspoken woman who wears trousers. But I'm not uncomfortable with this, and it's the discomfort that's why I think this is not particularly satisfying explanation. The candidate cognition in systemizing, which is a wish to have everything arranged well, ordered well, and for the world to make sense. And this has also had some there's some data showing that this might be related. So Hendricks et al. Is the only paper that I know of on this cognition. It's slightly underpowered, but it does have some interesting data. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the understanding of appearance, reality, sex, and gender in young children and in those who are autistic. So appearance reality, which I'll explain in a minute, is quite likely to be a cognition that you need for symbolic thought. And symbolism in general and symbolic language in particular are also cognitions that are different in ASD. Sex and gender constancy, which I'll also explain in a minute, is much more closely related to appearance reality than in any other cognition that appears in development. So if you've done any developmental psychology, you'll remember conservation. It's a classic and well-studied area of cognitive development. These two cognitions that I'm talking to you about today are not as well studied. There's been a bit of a gap in the literature, but they are much more closely related to each other than other cognitions appearing at the same stage in development. So appearance reality, right, I'm going to need some answers from you. So the first object, what's that? No, it's a rubber. What about that one? That's a crayon. What about this one? No, it's a sponge. What about this one? No, it's a fridge magnet. What about this one? Well done. What about this one? What about this one? It's a toy. Actually, it's a crayon, sorry. And this one. That is actually a shell. Okay, so younger children, Flavel studied this extensively, they can be perception bound and they find it difficult to adjust when appearance is difficult to reality. There's only one study published on this in autism by Simon Baron-Cohen, who's well known in autism research, but also well known for publishing every bus ticket. So we can't be completely sure whether this is true, but he did compare autistic children with intellectual disabilities to children who were not autistic with intellectual disabilities. So their difficulty in understanding when the appearance is different to the reality is not due to intellectual disability. We can be fairly sure of that. Right, so here, if I can get it to play. So he is confident that his mother really thinks this is a scary thing. And he makes sure so he's projected his appearance reality confusion onto his mother, and he's fairly sure that he needs to reassure her by showing her, no, it's really me. Right, so sex and gender constancy, in order, the proposed order of development is that children, first of all, have a gender identity. I'll explain why I don't like that term in a minute. And then they have gender constancy, which is made up of gender stability, in which they first understand that they themselves, and then they understand about other people, that you cannot change sex across your lifespan. And then they have gender consistency or sex consistency, which is when you understand that first yourself and then others cannot change sex by changing your appearance or preferences or preferred toys. So this comment, Johnny says he's going to be an airplane builder. Jimmy says, I'm going to be a mommy. Johnny says, you can't be a mommy, you have to be a daddy. No, I'm going to be a mommy. So this is an example from Kohlberg, 1966, of a lack of gender stability for himself. He's at the earliest stage. So for all of the terminology, all of the original authors meant sex. So they say things like biological gender, there are only two genders, and you cannot change gender. That is only male and female. So I tend to use sex/gender to make my papers more searchable, because people will be looking for gender constancy. They won't be looking for sex constancy. I did a Google Ngram search, and there's almost no papers that say sex constancy.
Is this a boy or a girl?
Girl.
It's a girl. And is this a boy or is this a girl?
Boy.
It's a boy. Well, what would happen if we took this and gave this to this doll?
It would be a girl.
It would be a girl? Why would it be a girl?
Because it has a pocketbook.
Because it has a pocketbook? Is this doll a boy or a girl?
A girl.
Okay, and is this doll a boy or a girl?
A boy.
A boy. Okay, so what would happen if we took this and gave it to that doll?
The boy would have a purse and the girl wouldn't.
So at At the age of 4, the little girl is convinced that the boy has turned into a girl by the use of sex stereotype female accessories. And by the age of 9 or 10, she knows that the other girl knows that this doesn't happen. So, right. So, clinical findings from groups. Anyway, I'll just explain what it says. So stability, that's can you yourself change, comes first. And Fast and Olson found that in younger children diagnosed with gender dysphoria and their siblings, stability was delayed. Now, they said that consistency, which comes later, was not delayed, but it wasn't in place yet in any of the kids in their study. And Ken Zucker, he's the only person who's here who I'm quoting, found that consistency was poorer in older children who should have achieved this, who had gender dysphoria. So they thought that if you put on a dress, you turn into a girl. And then, as I've said, appearance reality is poorer in autistic children. So this is what's been found so far. So here's what we did. We had kids who were 10 to 15 years old who were autistic and who had some kind of verbal delay. I can't say for sure if they had an intellectual disability. We had typically developing peers, and we had typically developing 4 to 6 year olds. So these were like those above. Can you change from a boy to a girl when you get older? Can you change from a girl to a boy if you put on a firefighter's outfit? Can the teddy change into a ghost by putting on a costume? And we thought that the appearance reality, stability would appearance reality and consistency would be poorer in autistic children, but stability would be okay because the younger children were, even the youngest typically developing children, were old enough that they should have grasped this. So this is slightly difficult to see. I'm sorry, it was better on a really big screen. So let me just talk you through this. First one on the left is stability. So that's the autistic group, and that's the typically developing younger group. This, I will come back to later, is the teenagers, the typically developing teenagers. Okay. This one is consistency. This is that if you put on a dress, do you become a boy or a girl? And above chance, or at chance, were the autistic group. Above chance were the typically developing teenagers, and above chance were at chance were autistic teenagers and typically developing little kids. And then this is appearance reality, and everybody found that quite difficult, so I'll talk a little bit about that first. So in summary, the autistic teenagers found it difficult to work out whether somebody could turn into a boy or a girl by putting on a dress, as did the typically developing younger kids, which is not that surprising, that's what we expected. So, but nobody's seen this before in autistic older kids or in autistic kids at all. But the typically developing teenagers were absolutely fine with that. They behaved like that little girl and just were like, why are you asking me these stupid questions? And then on stability, however, this age appropriately, the younger typically developing kids knew that they couldn't turn into a mummy if they were a boy, and so did the autistic teenagers. But strangely, the typically developing teenagers were like, yeah, sure, you can be a man if you want to when you're older. We suspect that they are answering a different question. We asked these first, and then we asked the consistency questions. Then we asked the dress and toy questions. And I'll talk to you about what I think might be happening later. The appearance reality, nobody really got it. So we tested the autistic kids first, and we were like, they don't understand appearance reality. This is replicated Baron Cohen, but nobody else got it either. And what happens with that, I think, is that nobody has actually tested this particular version of the test. You need to make sure that people you think will be at ceiling on a test are at ceiling on a test, or your test is no good. And I think that what was happening was that there were some items that were really, really ambiguous. And one of them is the Muller-Lyer illusion, which is the one where if you have a line, you can make it look longer or shorter by putting arrows on the end of it. And I have since found out that kids find that illusion very difficult. So that's something I want to do again, but we're not that concerned about it. We're more concerned about the delay in consistency in the autistic kids and the weird answers for stability from the typically developing teenagers. So then we decided to look at progression of these abilities in older children and adults. So Flavel expanded on his appearance reality studies, and now 6-year-olds, 12-year-olds, and adults, which of these two objectives are better for a game? And the game is some things look like one thing, but are really and truly another. So I will just show you, not this one, but this one, next one. Okay, so this is an example of things that were in the game. So some people have these two objects on their chair, if you'd like to pick them up now. We have a cup and we have a small toy. So the game is things that look like one thing, but are really and truly another thing. So just feel the objects that you've got, and what do you think the answer is? Yep, you're right. You've got a point for right. What's your reasoning? We also asked people what their reasoning was. Yes, so it looks like a piece of Lego. Well done, because none of the developmental psychologists earlier in the week got that. So it looks like a piece of Lego, but really and truly it is a rubber. So Baron Cohen thinks that appearance reality, this ability, is a special case of mentalizing because you have to work out that somebody else is trying to trick you. But not all examples are deliberately deceptive. Have you noticed that sometimes look one way, but really and truly are another way? This can include things that you cannot see what they really are, but nobody has tried to deceive you. So here is the example of that. There we go.
Okay, one last time. These are small, but the ones out there are far away. Small, far away.
So my students have no idea what this is, but I thought you guys would know. So the cows outside are not intended by an internal actor to deceive you. They are just there. They are still deceptive in some way. They still appear one way, but really and truly are another way. So it's not just a case of deception. So I extended this to sex and gender. Have you ever noticed that sometimes people think a job should be done by men, but really and truly a woman can do it? Have you ever noticed that some people think women should dress a certain way, but really and truly women can dress anyway? So which one of these is better for my game? Yeah, correct. So, and what's your reasoning? She's a firefighter. Yeah. So to get 4 points for your reasoning, you have to say because she's a firefighter and because people think that women shouldn't be firefighters, or because women are less often firefighters. So I have scored what people got right on this, but I haven't yet scored their reasoning. And so Flavel found that his college students were not at ceiling on his test, on his appearance reality test. And he also found that their reasoning was, in some cases, they got correct reasoning. So like if you said the cup, but the cup in my picture was square. If you said it's a cup, but cups aren't usually square, then that is correct reasoning, but an incorrect answer. And it is possible for some of the sex and gender questions to get the wrong answer, but right reasoning. And children and students were divided on who wears kilts, men or women. The students thought that men wear kilts and the school kids thought that women wear skirts. Preliminary results, this is just whether they got them right or not. So appearance reality, we have about 100 participants, 40 of whom were diagnosed with autism, and they were in a mainstream secondary school, or they were my students. And their ages 10 to 30, or there were a couple that were still in primary school. They were ranging from age 10 to 33, including some mature students. And both on the appearance reality and on the sex and gender questions, the number of right answers was lower for the autistic participants. And remember, these are not participants who've got an intellectual disability. I still need to break this down by age. I still need to look at the justifications for the answers. And I also need to check things like, do I have more autistic participants in the younger group? So I was relatively confident that we would get an effect with students, with neurotypical students, because Flavel found that they did not reach ceiling, and indeed my participants did not reach ceiling. And I'm also interested to see the difference in the autistic participants, because this is a very subtle test. Some participants didn't. Most participants kind of got it. A few participants didn't really get it, but just ploughed on. And then the difference between the elaboration of the answers is also going to be interesting. So that's my preliminary results. So my discussion, in the first study, the older autistic children with some language disability performed very like young school starters. They performed like 4 to 6 year olds. They did not have a clear understanding of whether you would change sex by putting on different clothing. And I did mention the language in older studies where they use gender to mean sex. This ability is also closely related to the understanding that the bodies of boys and girls are different. So there's another ancient study where they gave them photographs of naked toddlers, which I would not get past my ethics. So it's one of those where I think, I'm glad they did it because I'd never be able to do it, where they didn't understand that if a toddler dressed up differently, but still was the same, take toddler naked, that they were still the same sex. So it's closely related to that. And I think it is definitely related to the understanding of sex rather than the fluid concept that we have now of gender. And they were performing like the older primary school children, so older than my school starters, not end of primary school, the 6-year-olds or so in Ken Zucker's study. But there were issues with my sex and gender stability test. So the typically developing teens thought you could just change sex or gender. And as I said, I think they are answering a different question, but also they had me and they had a university student asking them questions, and they know I'm a university lecturer. So, the appearance reality test was difficult, but the younger children, the younger school starters, were definitely working on appearance. They were biased towards answering the question relating to appearance, and the other kids just didn't really get it. And in study 2, the test was more subtle. They were poorer at both appearance reality and stereotyping tasks. And the scores were not that high, so that this was comparable to Flavel's original studies. So he also tested 6-year-olds, which I haven't done yet. He tested 12-year-olds and university group. So gender dysphoria is distressing, and since we know that medical, social, surgical interventions don't improve mental health, we need to know more about how autistic children conceptualize sex and gender. And especially, I feel, from a cognitive point of view, because individual accounts and introspective accounts can only go so far. So talking therapies for a variety of mental health issues in autism can be problematic. And this has been linked to black and white thinking. And as we know, black and white thinking can itself be problematic. And I feel that this is a real, this is black and white thinking writ large. Something cannot be more than one thing at the same time. This curious finding in my typically developing adolescents, they were like the siblings and younger children who had gender dysphoria. They're like 3 and 4-year-olds or their siblings. And it could be a cohort effect because they were worse than the typically developing younger kids. But I think it might be partly an interviewer effect, and I want to do a new study. And that is my talk. Those are my findings, and I'm hoping to go further with this.